I know that AI is an area that you're becoming really interested in.
You spoke about human psychology. That's the biggest fear that I have.
There is a sort of thirst for originality.
The Saatchis had gotten so arrogant that they wanted to buy Midland Bank.
Yes.
A good entrepreneur is not the person who has all the ideas. You don't want everything to have an entrepreneurial culture. Banks who had entrepreneurial cultures led us to the global financial crisis. In a way, you are becoming, after having been an entrepreneur, an academic.
Welcome to the wild.
Welcome to the next episode of Entrepreneurs in the Wild. What we are doing is shedding light onto the world of the entrepreneur, what makes them tick, what makes them different. Also, could you even be an entrepreneur? Luckily for me today, we are joined by Professor Michael Jacobides, and he is a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at London Business School. He's also regarded as one of the finest minds in entrepreneurship and management globally. So it's going to be a fantastic episode. And I feel humbled to be in the same room with my PE and movement science degree from Liverpool University. So, Michael, it's brilliant that you were able to join us. Thank you so much. Perhaps you could just say a few words about yourself and your journey so far through the world of academia.
Oh dear, what can I say? Well, look, I'm both an academic who is excited to understand entrepreneurship, but also strategy. What excited me, what made me shift from economics that I was doing earlier on in life onto strategy and entrepreneurship is that I wanted to understand why we see different types of firms, why innovation starts sometimes in small firms, sometimes in big firms. Why is it that we see some distributions whereby people make a lot of profit and others don't, and in some settings people make similar amounts of profit. I was trying to understand the kind of things which naively I thought was part of economics, and it turns out not really, and it is part of management and strategy. So that was why I started looking at it. And the fun thing is that when I was younger, I was much more interested in strategy. I was like, entrepreneurship, but this is sort of the details of how people go about it. I want to see the big picture. And the more I started looking at the big picture, the more I realized that it is important to understand and explain the way in which individuals, whether in large or small organizations, take their energies and harness them and make stuff work. And the other part of me, in addition to being an academic, I'm an advisor, academic advisor now to BCG's Henderson Institute, and I have my own advisory group called Evolution Limited. And the reason is that in addition to being an entrepreneur myself, I guess, and taking some of the theories and applying them, I think that you actually learn when you are challenged to answer problems that people haven't answered before, and when you can apply your rigor because you're not bound by the need to generate sales or keep your colleagues busy, and provide real answers to those that need them. So that's a bit of the mix of where I come from and what my biases are.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I remember when we met in your office over a cup of coffee, I was trying to tell you that I wasn't a particularly gifted academic. It's true. Ask anyone. And I've had a fairly decent career as an entrepreneur without even really knowing that I was an entrepreneur or even knowing why or how. But I remember you said to me in a very sort of kind, considered way, oh, actually, you'll find that there are actually quite a lot of parallels between having a successful career in academia and being a successful entrepreneur. So I'd love to understand a little bit more about how you see that. What do you think the parallels are?
So let me first say what I mentioned then, I'd like to repeat now, which is that you may think that you are not really someone who connects or relates to academia, but I think that a past degree is a very poor surrogate of looking at your own academic inclination. What you were doing today is very close to what I, as a business academic, do. You're trying to understand what drives entrepreneurs, what allows some of them to work and some of them not. You are chronicling people's histories. You have your guests who speak about the past, other guests who speak about the future, your effort to learn from the past and project it into the future, and you're trying to help people figure out what the heck is happening around me and how can I make sense of it. To me, this is what academia should be about. It should be giving you some tools, and we use our own methods, and we've got our own arcane polysyllabic ways of ensuring that we check each other so that we don't veer off and we can't just bluff and we can't say the last thing that came to our head. But I think the objective is the same. So I think that the series that you have, the reason for which we're discussing, is that in a way you are becoming, after having been an entrepreneur, an academic. And I think that academics also want to create, at their best at least, they want to create new knowledge. They want to understand what people haven't quite gotten. And the same kind of curiosity that drives you as an entrepreneur, and you're like, I wonder whether that's going to work. And then you take resources together and you try it, and then you try to figure out what didn't quite work out. It is similar in the world of ideas. So I think that both in our method, there is a greater commonality when we try to develop new knowledge, or you try to develop new products, when you try to attack the new market. And also, I think that there is a lot of knowledge that is generated from the people in the field waiting for someone to absorb. I think that I learn, which is why I was saying that to me, my role as an academic and my role as an advisor is intertwined, because especially now, a little later in life, I think that I learn from having an exposure to the questions that people don't have a clear answer to. And I think that people in entrepreneurship are trying to ensure that they avoid mistakes by drawing on what is the best way of looking at the world.
It is quite interesting, some of the responses I'm getting. And a lot of it is about a circumstance rather than any kind of specific desire or an observation or a problem that needs to be resolved. It's often driven by they found themselves in a situation, there was a few other people around them, and they thought, why not? And so quite a lot of the entrepreneurs I have been speaking to have become entrepreneurs that way. And the other thing that I've noticed is that quite often, although money is involved, money isn't always the biggest driver. So I'm just wondering if any of that chimes with kind of your studies or experiences in the space.
Look, I think that fundamentally people are driven by a desire to achieve. Yeah. And I think that you see that usually when you see how much people work and whether they wanted to amass material worth. That's not what is really driving them. That is not something that will explain their behavior. They either want to prove something to themselves, they may want to prove something to the world, and in that sense, the pursuit of profit is an intermediate step. It is something which is a surrogate for. But the true objective is different. And then you get them, you see them as they need to get excited by the other thing that is there and is shiny, and they want to develop it. And I think that what you also see is that entrepreneurs are people who tend to have a combination of curiosity, that like trying something new because they would otherwise get bored when they've done that. So serial entrepreneurs, and quite often serious entrepreneurs, tend to be good in creating, in ramping up, in articulating particular types of firms, and then moving on and having the same cycle again. There's almost a bit of a division of labor for different types of entrepreneurs, for different types of life stages in the company, because you become good at a particular stage. I think that it's very rare to find someone who's very good from the inception to having a many billion-dollar company. It may be that someone says, I need to go through this bloody inception, but my real ambition is to drive a billion-dollar company. But you get more people saying, I've done this, now I'm moving to my next venture because my work is done. Once I have created a venture, I have made it really profitable. People are excited about the growth prospects. So the skill set is in building this journey. And you will more likely take this skill set and apply it to another setting. That's my understanding with the people that I see who are friends who are entrepreneurs themselves.
Yeah. And I think the other thing just linked to that is this sort of idea of an entrepreneurial culture. One of the sort of things that sort of seems to be cropping up is where there are entrepreneurial cultures, that's often a way of describing openness to risk, openness to innovation, high levels of empowerment, and things like that, and sort of traits, if you like. And I'm just wondering if if there's anything going on where one can quantify the performance of an entrepreneurial culture and compare that to a sort of less or non-entrepreneurial culture.
You're opening up a number of really important and deep questions. So let me start with the first thing that comes to mind, which is that you don't want everything to have an entrepreneurial culture. Banks who had entrepreneurial cultures led us to the global financial crisis because there were some people who thought, blimey, I'm going to get this wonderful idea of securitizing, and if you dress it up so nicely, nobody's going to figure it out, and I'm going to be bloody rich. Thank you very much. And the whole world is going to collapse. I don't want entrepreneurship there. I mean, I remember one of the case studies that I had written is a case study about Saatchi and Saatchi. And at some stage, the Saatchis had gotten so arrogant that they wanted to buy Midland Bank.
Yes,
and I think Thread and Needle Street was rightly concerned of the profusion of creativity for people who, as one of the later chairman said, couldn't even balance their checkbooks and were focusing on being entrepreneurs running a bank. So we need to be realistic. There are some cases, when you run railroad infrastructure, when you run banks, when you run nuclear stations, you do not want the same type of entrepreneurial culture. There are horses for courses. Now, that takes me to a deeper question. And this is one of the things that I've started looking at. Let me take you a little bit back to perhaps the first sort of serious scholar of entrepreneurship, who is Joseph Alois Schumpeter. And he wrote this book that many people still quote without having read it in 1911 in the Theory of Economic Development, where he was saying that, what really happens in the way that the economy develops is that you have these successive waves of entrepreneurs, and you have these companies that make these temporary profits, but you shouldn't worry because the world is competitive, and it is these profits that motivate the entrepreneurs, and then behind them is the next wave of people who are motivated by the things that have slipped through the cracks, and they will push them away, and then will come the new heroes. And essentially, technological progress does not happen by any rational means, but it happens by entrepreneurs who can sniff around the opportunities and then cobble them together, then turn them into marketable propositions, and the most clever of them win over these creative waves of creative destruction, as he called them, because of course the resources are liberated from the less effective and then go to the more effective new style organizations. Now, the same chap in 1945 wrote another book, Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. And he says, forget it. All of these ideas that I had were wrong. The innovation process is not a process whereby you have the people who are coming up with new ideas, who are pushing one entrepreneurial firm, pushing the other entrepreneurial firm out. No, what is really happening is that you've got large companies who have been vertically integrated in the innovation function. You have innovation labs, and you had Bell, and then you had other large companies that were popping about and that were integrating the innovation function, and big banks that keep the innovation function inside. And it's all been integrated in these big firms. Now, for a while, people were like, oh, well, these are two very different visions of entrepreneurship. And those of us who study innovation and technological change started speaking about them in terms of what was known as Mark I and Mark II, the two different types of innovations. And then people said, hey, some sectors look like Mark I, like Schumpeter's early work, where innovation comes with waves of successful creative destruction. And some of them, well, because they've got different technological opportunities, and because the knowledge is more cumulative, and because you are able to appropriate it, and because it's different displays, they look like Mark II. So why don't we just measure, and we can show you that different sectors map on differently. And that's kind of the way that things evolved. If you look carefully, what's happening today is that you have neither the first or the second, but you've got Mark III, a different way in which entrepreneurship in large and small companies works. And this has really transformed, and it's giving us a very peculiar world. What's really going on? What I see happening is that large firms are indeed dominating, and for all the discussion of disruption, if you look at the statistics carefully, you will see that the economy now is much more stable than it was 25 years ago. The top firms in Fortune 500 have a greater longevity than they had a quarter century ago, and we speak of disruption, but very little disruption is happening. What's really happening is interesting because you have a symbiosis of the small firms and the large firms.
Yes.
How does that work? First of all, and if you go to technology, and that certainly is true in many of the new technological areas, including AI, by the way, that you see that the firms don't try to grow to challenge dominant giants. They try to grow to become appetizing purchase opportunity for dominant players. The innovation in large firms is done by a combination of some acquisition so that you don't develop it inside, but you are adept enough to recognize it and either buy it because it's going to threaten you or buy it because you want to graft it inside with very mixed records of being able to do it effectively. A few people do it well, most people don't, but that's another story. Or creating alliances or forming ecosystems so that you can use your leverage and scale and financial access and combine with the activity of those that you collaborate with. So that the big firms become sustained, which is this paradox of bigger, stronger, less displaced firms with this fringe of innovators that are developing these companies primarily because they expect to enter the orbit of the large dominant players, whether they want to be part of their ecosystem or they want to be acquired by them. And you see that in all manner of sectors. You see that now, the transformation of automotive to mobility. For instance, well, what have we seen there? We have all this story that, oh my God, the world's going to be disrupted. Look at it. Case, it's going to all be connected and autonomous and electrified and shared. But other than two or three players, one big player, very vertically integrated, Tesla, and also some in the ride-hailing, most of them are the incumbents who have created tons of connections with entrepreneurial firms that come from other sectors. So if you start looking now at the maps of Ford, of GM, but also of their suppliers, people like Bosch, but also of firms like Tesla, you see them all branching out and connecting to entrepreneurial firms. So you have this interesting change in the division of labor because it is big tech, which has a huge role and dominant, probably overly dominant role, industrial incumbents and entrepreneurs who work in concert with them. So today's entrepreneurial landscape, I think, is increasingly looking as this new, what we call Mark III. I was speaking with an entrepreneur in the AI space recently who was saying that in most of the firms that he sees, they don't even develop the selling capability because they know that this isn't relevant for their long-term survival.
Yeah, that's an amazing observation, and something that hearing you talk about it really chimes with me. Obviously, our company, Iris, was bought by a Korean company called Chael, who is part of Samsung. We've done a study to try to make sense of all of this so that we can go to market better and win, more clients. But one of the things that we've learned is that companies that outperform the rivals in their categories tend to have a very, very strong, powerful core. So you have a very strong, stable core that's about profitability, and scale and all of those really sensible things, really important things. And then you have a sort of swirly mess of little small cogs that are just, running at 1,000,000 miles an hour that are sort of organized around that strong, stable core. And if you can do that sort of repeatedly, consistently over a period of time, you end up having innovations that are competitive, that you can take to market and make really good money from.
So you're absolutely right. But in a way, the interesting sort of new version of entrepreneurship is how do you combine entrepreneurship with existing business in a thoughtful way? And how can we be real about the potential areas to add value? And to me, it's also interesting because it changes the nature of entrepreneurship. I think that there are opportunities for the people who say, we can do better with the existing set of resources. But I think that it is not, we can do better and I will do a full-scale different alternative, but I need to find a way of complementing and connecting to some organization that already exists. So, it's got a bit of a different flavor.
I mean, in my 25 years working in marketing, I have found that entrepreneurial behaviours are really good and positive. They are not always practiced by actual entrepreneurs, though. It's like there are traits that are sometimes adopted, sometimes quite short term, but they're often like the more kind of creative, lateral thought, and the charismatic. Often things that are more emotional. You know what I mean? But in actual fact, I've actually only worked with a relatively few entrepreneurs, i.e., people that have started a business, grown a business, sold a business, things that are really quite difficult.
I think what you're saying makes me think about one more important distinction, which is that a good entrepreneur is not the person who has all the ideas. Yeah. It's the person that drives the context where people who have the ideas can create them and help them put together in an effective way. I think that there's often a misapprehension, and you think that the entrepreneur is the person who has the creative genius. I think that this is vastly oversold. Many entrepreneurs are not as technically gifted, or as thinkers are not as able to conceptualize what is new. Their skill is in figuring out how to listen, support, and broker ideas that come to them, and rather than reject them wholesale, put them in a package that will be successful. And I think that when we think about the myth of entrepreneurs, of course, that is partly the problem of entrepreneurs themselves, because of course they let us say, oh yeah, sure, of course it was me. Well, it kind of wasn't. You know what? It's even better if you say it wasn't. If you say that my role is to figure out a good idea rather than come up with it. And I think that many of the challenges here is that people have extended what they had done themselves and what they simply created the context for. They tend to want to provide this heroic vision of themselves. I think the reality is a bit messier, but it's great because the value of entrepreneurs are the people who are able to take ideas, whether it's theirs or not, make them work, drive them to the next level.
Yeah. Just moving on, just following on this sort of theme of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship, particularly when it comes to sort of big companies. We were talking with the marketing director of Samsung about the launch of the S24, and it's AI, and all the storytelling around the phone is all about AI and what that can do. We got into this really interesting discussion about how it can enable entrepreneurs, and it can be a leveler. It can allow the entrepreneur to do more quicker, allow entrepreneurs to compete against scale, all these things. So I'm just wondering, because I know that AI is an area that you're becoming really interested in. I'm just wondering, how you feel about AI and the topic of the entrepreneur, and what you think, positively and negatively, if you like, will affect the world and also the entrepreneurs that are in it.
Well, I mean, my concern is I'm a bit ambivalent, and I literally am losing sleep as I try to figure out what the heck is happening. I have spent the last few months working on AI. I had done some previous work on AI as well. And one of the things that we know about, so we have to distinguish between two things. We have to distinguish between AI in terms of its more traditional form and Gen AI, generative AI, and in particular, the technology that has provided the ability of natural language answers and support and programming, and now multimodal, which is what is growing and what we expect to see expand, and in probably a couple of years' time also be melded together with what we thought was dead but is simply dormant and growing, which is the metaverse and AR, XR. It will become, again, very important. People sort of looked at it before its time, but if you combine the two technologies, you can have some pretty powerful things once the latency issues, which is what has held the AR, VR technology back, are resolved, and we know what roughly the timeline is for these. So I think that what we know about AI, and I'll move to Gen AI because we know much less about it, but we're right now engaged in a number of efforts to try to understand Gen AI as well. What we know about AI is that, so for instance, when we looked at what were the implications of AI on firm stability, the ability of creating competitive advantage, is that AI tends to lead to a more uneven world. It tends to benefit the companies that have a digital DNA and that are poised to leverage the technological advantages from what we used to call big data and predictive analytics.
Yes.
AI is essentially computational statistics. So we have seen that AI has increased the inequality of income distribution, enhanced the power of big tech.
Yeah.
You have seen the growth of some companies, and if you look at the stack of the full set of activities that exists in the world of AI, what you saw is that you had companies that were active downstream, the people who would do the modeling like Google and the technology front end, possibly like Microsoft, were also providing the computational background. So you had the hyperscalers, and the hyperscalers are Microsoft, they are AWS, by far the most profitable part of Amazon. So you see big technology companies, and you see in China, some of the big technology companies in China doing again the hyperscaling and the dominance in the core. You do see the emergence of some players who are able to take advantage of the opportunities that AI gives them. But again, I think that AI, if anything, increases the dominance of a handful of firms because of the production economics and because of their ability of expanding massively throughout. I'm a bit concerned also that those firms are trying to shape the PR by saying that the world will become more democratic. It'll become more democratic in a very limited way, and there are a number of firms that may find themselves in trouble. Let's think about the creative world now, and now we're going to be to Gen AI. What do we expect to see happen in Gen AI? Some things are going to be similar, but some things are going to be different, partly because Gen AI operates on different types of data, partly because Gen AI can challenge different types of services. So in terms of Gen AI, what we can see is that there are some sectors that are likely to be disrupted. So if you take the creatives, for instance, right now you can say, hey, this is amazing. It's awesome because none of these are real people. All of that is synthetic. I had no shooting, I had no constellation, no whims, no problem of people who want to be made up 4 times and then it's raining and you need to start it again. So all of that was friction. And I told him, yeah, but the problem is that you're friction too. So I think that what is happening is that there is a risk that the advances in Gen AI, although they give the ability of individuals to be much more productive, may also put organizations or parts of the economy out of business. What we're now looking at, and there's a big project that I'm doing, one with Institute directors and some other with some private equity firms, is to start looking at, well, what else matters? Because I think that we're going to see some new opportunities for entrepreneurship because people will be able to find the ways of using technology and displacing existing firms. But you may find some traditional areas of activity, including in the creative sector, that are simply not going to be used. Why? Because, well, I went to use the services of a marketing company because I was clueless. I had a product. I knew how to sell it, but I didn't know how to create a logo. And right now, I can create a logo for my own company. When I created a logo, I went to someone and worked for a few weeks, and we found exactly how to write the E of evolution. It was all very clever. But now I wonder whether what I would have done is just spend a few minutes in the computer, and I'm like, how many other people will actually do that? You're going to say, yeah, but there is a number of people who will want the fanciest stuff. Yeah, sure. But I think that the existence of Gen AI with a bit of intelligent prompting may create existential problems for parts of the activity, including people who would pride themselves in being entrepreneurial. So, will it help or will it challenge? I think we're going to see that it's going to be a very mixed picture, and we're now trying to figure out what this depends on.
That's a brilliant way of framing the whole debate, specifically in and around our industry, which I think has been under some pressure for a while for all sorts of different reasons. Offshoring, nearshoring, clients taking more and more of their own work in-house. And I think that there's no doubt about it that the kind of adoption of, technologies that, that can help people do work quicker, cheap, whatever, more efficient. I think that's definitely going to be a factor. But I think the other thing that I'm also starting to see at the same time is there is a sort of thirst for originality. There's a thirst for yes, of course. And also we now need to sharpen our minds around how do we do things that feel more emotional, more breakthrough, that can work as a partner to that.
Another thing that is very important, you spoke about human psychology. That's the biggest fear that I have. There's actually an interesting study going on right now in MIT with looking at whether scientists can see how people can be manipulated to have false memories. This shows you how technology can really play games with your brain. One of the things that we had started doing with behavioral science is say, hey, people have biases and shortcomings, which, by the way, as a species have been wonderful because they have allowed us to preserve our mental energy and be adaptive and all the rest of it. But we do carry some of these habits. The problem is that when you have habits of that sort, when you have these predispositions, and if you have those who can study them and then see how they can manipulate you, you're starting to be in serious problems, right? If, for instance, we find ways of making you think that something that is not true is, like having a false memory, and that we find a way that AI allows us to tease that out, you have a lethal weapon that can be used for advertising or for proselytizing or for polarizing or for getting us worse than Trump and Brexit in terms of elections. And I am concerned that 2024 we're going to see some efforts to use that. And the people who will most want to use it are the people with the most crooked of messages. So my concern is that the understanding of the human frailties, which we saw, by the way, with social media, can lead to exploitation. And this is why I think that there's an interesting question of what is the role of regulation. I mean, we regulate things like psychotropic substances and recreational drugs and the use of alcohol because we understand that they work in a way that the body gets taken over by them. If we find ways that AI can create things that give you insurmountable attraction to particular products, is this okay? Where do you draw the lines?
Yeah, I mean, just as a human, I'm saying, of course, it's not okay. But then I think
as a
about
marketer,
it,
you're like, oh my God.
And then I'm thinking, hang on, you're onto so. Let me make a note of this. But I'm also thinking, like, how much are we already doing? Because and I'm not going to say that it's about false emotions, false memories, or anything like that. But I do know that for quite some time now, just the sort of coding that exists in a brand, whether it's colours or Christmas imagery or a certain musical setting, or how that is often used to change the context of an audience.
I mean, great art is about creating the emotions that move you. And you're like, well, I should steer clear of that. The people who have done that intuitively for years and years now can't be told, well, you can't do it more systematically. I mean, there have been efforts of studies of understanding how you can combine things to affect your psychology. I'm not saying that any of that would be off limits. What I am saying, though, is that we are moving into an interesting world. And you're speaking earlier on about which part of it is going to be AI and which part of it is going to be humans. We may want to not let things run for themselves and by themselves.
Yeah.
We will be faced to think about stuff that happens in an industrial scale. I mean, again, let me give you an example. Right now, one of the things that we're concerned with is that if you let even ChatGPT 4 or Claude loose, they can start writing in your style. And you could say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, if you have provided the training and if your voice can be replicated, even though you don't think that the content is right, the question is, whose IP is it, part one? And part two, if you're using someone's voice and the content is BS, isn't that dangerous? Because right now what I can control is my style, my ability of explaining, whether it's convincing or not, and also what I say. Imagine now that someone can imitate you, emulate you, and then can say very similar things and change the content. It does lead to both of these issues. And you could say that in theory, this is something that someone who's very sharp and understands the linguistics could do before. Sure, but it would be bloody difficult. It would take a heck of a lot of time and training. It'd probably take years of someone who has been the speechwriter of someone to do that. And it would be difficult to put together. Right now, you feed some documents and you can create that. So it leads you to new types of issues. And I'm also concerned about the way that this will change, if you want to go to communications, the communication messaging and what the role for the individual is. It will be some combination of man and machine. The way that human beings will need to interact with technology, both in terms of how we as a society regulate it and also how firms need to work on that. I mean, this is going to be a huge open question that we need to give some careful thought to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you. One of the things that really struck me as you were talking was like one of the sort of things that might happen is suddenly somebody is able to influence somebody else by emulating either someone that they know or might be influenced by. One of the things that we've noticed in our survey called the Participation Brand Index is how powerful it is, that the effect that someone has on one of their friends in terms of a purchasing outcome. It is becoming more and more important, we think. And then if, let's say, suddenly someone is able to sort of mimic a trusted friend, a trusted advisor, or wherever, without it actually being them, with actually not having the same motive, where they're doing it to help their friend, so therefore I trust it. I mean, and then suddenly you end up with this sort of incredible process where
some of this is happening, and we're already advertising. What exactly do you trust, and what is the role in terms of communication of the people in the communications field? I mean, it starts raising some pretty existential questions.
And I think the other thing is, as consumers, humans, we are overloaded with content, interactions, interactivity, and I just know that at some point in time that we'll go enough with all of this stimuli, this content, and there'll be nothing to be gained by surrounding us with more messages, because we won't be able to absorb them, act upon them, understand them, distinguish between them, whether it's AI driven or not. We will definitely see that. And working more in dynamic with, like the principles that you described earlier on, also about, performance marketing and how that works.
And perhaps it may be a little bit more closely integrated to the business objectives, because one of the things that I think we're still good at doing as humans is setting the parameters of what we need to look at. I think that the things that are simpler execution are going to be challenged because you can do them more flawlessly and seamlessly through technology. But I think there's going to be a significant amount of disruption. So part of my concern is that right now there's a bit of a techno-optimism, and I'm afraid that some of the advisors and banks are guilty of enhancing that. I mean, I read in my book, very embarrassing study by McKinsey that was saying Gen AI is going to increase profitability 4.4 trillion. I looked at this study and read it, some detail. I'm like, really? I study this kind of stuff. First of all, how the heck do you come to this number? And it is a big number. Second, walk me through the assumptions. And I read it and I couldn't quite come up with it. So I emailed the guy who's the lead author and the head of the McKinsey Global Institute and said, hi guys, so help me because I can't quite figure out the way that you do that. Because I saw whatever appendix, but just the calculations evade me how you can come to something like profits. And they said, well, we looked at all of these use cases. Everyone is crazy about use cases of Gen AI right now, and all the consultants are running around saying, use cases. And essentially, how can you not hire people or fire people? But usually it's more in the not hire and gradually replace. And then we said all of these productivity gains, and then new product development gains, although, if everyone has them, they can't add up. Someone needs to lose business, by the way. And then we added them all up. I said, yes. And then basically that's economic value. And we assume that it will flow in profits. I said, forgive me. If you're telling me that this is something that would be available to everyone, it would eventually be competed away and the consumer would benefit. Am I missing something? And the embarrassing answer was, well, not really. Let me explain a couple of details. And, I was looking at that. And of course, this was just, some heavy amount of smoke and mirrors that translated what could potentially be productivity benefits onto profits by saying, oh, economic value. Unfortunately, if you think about why, well, think about the board. If the board is being told, here's a 4.4 trillion opportunity, don't you want to be a part of it? You get excited. You pay them for, 10 million for their advisories. Then you pay the technology people another 30, 40 to give you all the good tech you need. And you say, this is good investment because look at this huge amount of money at the end of the rainbow. That's not the way Gen AI is going to work out. Gen AI is going to transform us. It's going to make new winners and losers. And I think that rather than thinking about this as only the addition of the individual features, we need to say, if you put all the features together, what does that mean for me strategically?
Listen, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast, Professor. I've loved the conversation. I just had one last little question before we wrap up, and it's more to do with, there will be entrepreneurs who watch this, hopefully, and I just, is there any kind of words of advice that you would want to sort of give on to the entrepreneur or people kind of thinking about embarking on a career as an entrepreneur?
Well, look, I think that what probably is going to make the biggest, there's a fine line between confidence in a plan and delusion of grandeur. And I think that you need to have an evolving vision and on the one hand, not give up because you're not able to do what you want as quickly as you want or as effectively as you want, or things didn't quite pan out. But you also need to ensure that you learn from how the world evolves around you.
Yes.
And I think that to me, this is one thing that I would really try to think of. That's probably the hardest thing that you need to do as an entrepreneur. You need to ensure that you have a view, that you are not deterred, but that you also learn. So that's probably the hardest thing to do. The other thing is to say that success is not a solitary sport. and that it'll come both from engaging with others who can complement you at the level of the team, and from finding the right ecosystems that will support what you want to do and that will allow you to navigate and pivot. So these are my 2 final words of advice.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us on Entrepreneurs in the Wild. That's been a fantastic episode. Tune in next time. Feel free to get this particular episode wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you.